This is video 2, relationship churning, physical violence, and verbal abuse in young adult relationships. So, first thing they did was define what emergent adulthood was. And emergent adulthood would be your late teens to your mid to late 20s, sorry. I was defined. It's emergent adulthood would be your late teens to your mid to late 20s, and is defined as a time of exploration where your romantic relationships take center stage. Relationship churning would be a form of relationship instability, and emergent adults are deemed the age of instability. So when you're in a churning relationship, you have a lower quality relationship, and they face more conflict. Intimate partner violence is frequent among emergent adults, right? So the family conflict theory argues that there is a process of escalation that leads from verbal abuse to physical violence. So arguments escalate into physical fights. So situational couple violence is a result of poorly managed relational conflict, is what they're suggesting with this theory. So the instability of churning relationships could arise from a process of escalation and poor relationship skill. So basically what that's saying is that because in churning relationships instability is kind of expected, this abuse is more likely to happen because it's an escalation from that argument, and that lack of communication escalates into these big fights. Stronger communication skills and being able to handle conflict all stop and lower rates of intimate partner violence. However, those aren't really characteristics of on and off relationships. Relationships are marked by churning and conflict, are distinctively both positive and negative in their characteristics. Relationship churning and conflict may be related, and that they both may result from processes of escalation and inability to regulate conflict. So they're basically saying that churners are more likely to have violence in their relationships due to the way that they handle their conflicts and they go about that relationship. So this is my methodology. They used a study from Toledo County, Ohio, and that was like a census study, and it happened in 4 waves, right? So they ended up picking, I think it happened in 5 waves, but they ended up picking the 4th wave, and that was 17 to 24-year-olds. So they would be emerging adults. The sample ended up being 792 people, and it focused on relationship churning and conflict. Conflict being either physical violence or verbal abuse. They examined both negative and positive aspects of relationships along with the duration length. Age, race, ethnicity, family structure, respondent lived in as a teenager, and parents' level of education all went into defining the sample size. And because emerging adults don't really have a set income yet, because because they're like in college and they're like building themselves up, they're using the parents' level of education to kind of like set up how they're gonna do type thing. Commitment was measured on a 5-point scale. Intimate self-disclosure was measured on how often people talk about the specific topics, that because intimate self-disclosure is being able to talk about deep topics and that type of thing. So that's how they measured that. And communication was also on a 5-point scale. My results: 40% of respondents reported physical violence, and just over half reported verbal abuse. So that's a lot of people, like a lot of people in this study. Nearly 1/3 of them had both verbal abuse and physical violence. Most common relationship status was churning in this study. So that really says something, you know? One fourth of those in stable relationships reported physical conflict. Verbal abuse was the most prevalent in churning relationships. Fewer than one fifth of people in stable relationships experienced both types, while over half of churners experienced verbal abuse or physical violence. While over half of Turners experience both physical violence and verbal abuse. Being older male and having a worse temper during adolescence are all like indicators that you are gonna have an experience with verbal abuse. Churners were twice as likely as those who were stably together or apart to report physical violence. To report physical violence in their relationships. And they were half again as likely to report the presence of verbal abuse in their relationships. Most conflicts were not those most conflicts and most of these like issues showed up in people that were not choosing to permanently exit their relationship. Churning, so basically what they want us to take away from this study is that churning is becoming a norm in emerging adulthood and emerging adulthood. Oh my Lord Jesus Christ, I am so sorry. I had a brain fart. My sister walked into the room. Okay, anyways, churning becoming a norm is a red flag because it brings along higher levels of abuse, higher levels of physical violence, and those are all indicators of unhealthy relationships. So it's a really big red flag that relationship churning is being normalized in this age group. And thank you. That was video 2.